Good evening. Welcome to the latest edition of Last Bell Boxing. This evening we're doing a special, as you can see from the caption. It's topics 80s, but we're concentrating on the four kings. Me and Chris's favourite era. I think, Chris, you don't mind me saying so?
No, not at all. Not at all. Absolutely love this era, especially the four kings.
Good evening, mate. You doing okay?
Yeah, I'm doing really well actually, and I've been thinking a lot about this topic today, so I'm looking forward to talking about it. It's one we suggested before, and you know, me and you've got a real love and passion for Marvin Hagler, and I have actually for all the four kings, to be fair, and I've got them in order, and you know, I'm sure it will come out when we discuss the fights, just how much we both enjoy them, and still even to this day enjoy watching their fights.
Yeah, exactly, mate. There'll be a lot of people that perhaps subscribe to us that are a lot younger than we are, let's say, that will have heard of these fighters, obviously, but maybe haven't seen them as much as maybe we have.
Yeah.
So hopefully the passion that we show on here will hopefully make them go and watch some YouTube footage.
Totally. I don't know about you. How did you actually discover the four kings? Can you remember when you came across them for the first time?
Yeah, he's actually my old man, mate.
Was it?
Yeah, he was a massive Marvin Hagler fan, and from when I was very young, probably one of the first conversations I actually remember with my dad was talking about boxing, talking about Marvin Hagler, and Harry thought, he thought Marvin Hagler was the best ever. And then obviously it's only years later when you really appreciate it.
Yeah.
But let's forget about ourselves in this conversation and let's get on to it. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on each of the fighters, just some basics, so people kind of get the idea of how good these guys really were. I'll start off with Roberto Duran. Roberto Duran's career went from 1968 to 2001. Would you believe? He had 100. He won 103 fights, lost 16. And had 70 KOs, which works out to a 59% knockout ratio. He was a world champion at four weights, staggeringly. And I couldn't believe this when I read it. I had to read it a couple of times. He actually started his career at bantamweight. His first fight was at bantamweight, and he went on to fight Ray Leonard at one point in his career for the super middleweight title of the world.
Yeah.
Unheard of, that distance between weights.
Absolutely. A proper throwback is Duran, isn't he? And as you say, you've just read his record out, but the one thing about Duran is when you look at him, how active he was during that initial, say, 20-year period in his career. Yeah. And even after he won his first world title in 1973, he had so many non-title fights, to keep active. It was unbelievable. He really was, a true fighter in every sense of the word. An absolute legend, Roberto Duran. And that record, 103, 16, 70 kilos, unparalleled. Could you imagine a fighter in this day and age, since we've seen Julio Cesar Chavez, we've probably never seen a fighter having over 100 fights. It's just unbelievable.
It'll never be seen. It will never be seen again, mate. Because when these fighters get to the top end, they only fight twice a year.
Yeah. And when you see as well, sometimes the manner of his victories, after he got beat by Lenard, which I'm sure we'll touch upon, to win his other world titles, when he fought Davy Moore and Iran Barkley, those performances were exceptional, and at the age that he was, in 1989, he fought Iran Barkley for the middleweight crown, and that was the ring fight of the year. So taking aside the four kings, as we're going to discuss, they were all involved in performances which were legendary against other fighters out with the four kings, and that's what makes them so special.
Individually, mate, if you take away the context of the four kings, individually, they're all outstanding world-class fighters that no one can take anything away from. And they've all done exceptional stuff in their careers, forgetting the other three, Yeah,
totally. Because if you excluded the four kings from each other's career, they would still be first Hall of Fame balloters at Canastota.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's so brilliant about it. The fact that, we've got this context that all four of them fought each other a number of times, and with mixed results. It's such a great tale.
Yeah.
I mean, Roberto Duran had no right to be fighting for the middleweight title.
No.
He had no right. But he still went on and won it.
No, and I tell you, when you watch the fight, and people think that Iran Barkley, was just some kind of patsy, and he landed a lucky shot and beat Tommy Hearns to win that WBC middleweight title. They also forget that Iran Barkley beat Tommy Hearns at light heavyweight years later, and he also beat a really competent champion called Darren Van Horn to win the super middleweight title. So Iran Barkley himself is a 3-weight world champion, and Duran comes out and beats him in 1989 in the fight of the year. Honestly, that fight, excluding, as we say, the Four Kings, Barkley-Duran, is one of my favourite fights of all time. And when Duran puts that kind of like 5-punch combination together, I think it's in the 11th round, and knocks Barkley down, it's legendary. And at that weight, which Duran was at that point, fighting at middleweight, he went up to super middleweight where he fought Vinny Pazienza as well. Paz said that Roberto Duran was the hardest hitting puncher he'd ever fought. And that was at super middleweight when Duran was in his 40s.
That's crazy coming from a bantamweight fighter in his first fight.
Unbelievable.
That middleweight fight against Barkley was 21 years after his pro debut.
It's insane.
It's staggering, isn't it?
And the thing I loved about Duran... Sorry, go on.
I don't know how you're going to... I don't think I can put them into a 1-4. I'll have a go. But I don't think I can. But I don't know how you're going to put it. But not to be a spoiler, I'm probably going to have Duran bottom of the pile.
It's a funny one for me because I put them. I've got two ways to look at them. My favourite fighters, and then I've got to rate them as they performed against each other.
Yeah.
And for me, when anybody says to me, "Who's your favourite fighters?" I automatically always name 3 of the 4 Kings. I was never a Sugar Ray fan. I never really got them. But I really appreciate them. But for me, Duran, Hearns, and Haggler are 3 of my favourite fighters of all time. So I rate them in a different way, maybe sometimes when people ask me. So I rate them in popularity, but then I can actually be subjective, and I think I've got an order for who was actually the best. So,
all right, just let's move on then to Tommy Hearns next. Okay. Tommy Hearns' career spanned from 1977 to 2006. Again, wow. Near on 30 years.
29 years.
His record was 61-5-1 with 48 knockouts, which works out to a staggering 71% KO ratio.
Yeah.
For a fighter that you look at Tommy Hearns in his early career, he's such a great back foot fighter. Brilliant movement, but he has so much power.
Yeah.
Them levers that he had. I mean, and how does somebody the size of Tommy Hearns make welterweight, mate?
It's just absolutely unbelievable. When you see him, he's over 6 foot, they say. Tommy Hearns, is he 6'1"? I think Tommy Hearns. And when you see him getting down to 147, and he was there as an amateur as well. And you see him in those early days as he was coming through. And when one of my favourite fights of Tommy Hearns is when he won the title against a guy called Pepino Cuevas. And you look at Hearns' shoulders, even at 147, and his body's like a triangle. Yeah. His shoulders are massive. Then he's got these little pipe cleaner legs there. And you think, how the hell could you even absorb a shot? Because the legs just looked like they had absolutely nothing. But as you say, Andy, his arms were long. His muscles were really lean. He was just an absolutely fantastic specimen at that level. But one thing that people forget there as well is, at 147, he actually was a great boxer. And as you say, he moved well, he boxed well, and he really was a product of Emmanuel Stewart's gym down in Kronk, in Detroit. They made fighters, but they also made really good boxers. And Tommy Hearns, people dispute how many titles he really won. He went right up to cruiserweight, really, if we include the IBO and the WBU, which in itself is absolutely amazing.
And I've got them on the list for obvious reasons.
And while we can't recognise those as legitimate world titles because of the time actually when he won them, what it just shows is he was still able to operate at that level. And the other thing about Hearns, which is absolutely amazing, he fluctuated in his weight, didn't he? And we mentioned a fight a number of months ago, remember, on our show, where Hearns went up and he fought Dennis Andrews at light heavyweight. But after that, he came back down. But what was so special about that is Andrews was a career light heavyweight. Hearns knocked him down 6 times. So he carried his power right up to 12 stone 7 and then was able to bring it back down again.
Speaking about that, so he fought Dennis Andrews in 1987 at light heavyweight.
Yeah.
The same year, he dropped down to middleweight after the middleweight titles were vacated and won the middleweight title.
Yeah, yeah.
It's nuts.
Just absolutely insane, and he just kind of bounced around those weights. And I was showing you when we were in Nottingham a few weeks back that I'd managed to pick up the Ring magazine from Hearns and Haggler, the actual official program for it. The two of them standing side by side as well. You can see the difference in height between them. It's absolutely crazy. So Tommy Hearns was one of the guys that made me fall in love with boxing. And it was. Like there was an old series, an old video series, which Top Rank brought out, and it was called The Fabulous Four. I'd never even heard of the guys necessarily when I bought it, and watching Hearns knock out Duran and watching him fight Marvin Hagler, Tommy Hearns was my favourite from the get-go. And I was lucky enough to see him fight when he fought in Manchester against was it Nate Miller again on the Nassim Hamid undercard when he fought Paul Ingle, but Hearns was gone by that point. He was really old, but I was just so glad I got to at least watch one ring walk against him. It was a fantastic experience to actually see him. But Hearns, 61-5-1, 48 KOs. Oof, extraordinary.
That face-off of him side by side, him and Haggler. I mean, Haggler was a proper middleweight, a solid middleweight.
Yeah.
But you look at him and you got to think. God, clearly Hearns is the bigger fighter. Clearly Hearns, you won't think Hearns started off at welterweight.
No, not at all, not at all. And when you see them in that face-off, you can actually understand now, looking back, why Hearns was actually one of the favourites going into that fight. Because a lot of people were saying this guy is going to absolutely destroy Haggler because they thought Haggler was looking a bit jaded and a bit past it, even in 1985. And no, it's just unbelievable what both of them did. Who's next on your intro then? Who's next on your intro?
Those 3 rounds, still to this day, I watched it back last week or the week before. I have to watch it at least once a month. I'm still staggered every single time I do.
Yeah.
It doesn't grow old. I suggest anybody that's watching this show, that's the first one of the 4 Kings fights you watch.
Yeah.
It will blow your mind.
As I say, your dad talked to you about the guys. I didn't have that experience. My parents and things like that went into boxing, so I was discovering boxing on my own. And I actually bought that Fabulous Four video in a shop one time, and I never knew much about it, but I just knew that I wanted to know more about boxing. And within that video, it has the full 3-round war. And that was the first time I seen it, and I remember watching it for the first time, thinking, "Wow, this sport is amazing." And I'm like you, I will watch it maybe once every 8 weeks or so, and just go back to it. And even if it's maybe only the first round, or even if it's only the knockouts, you just find yourself just flicking through it, and then you'll go, right, I need to watch Tommy Hearns versus James Schuler, or I need to watch Roberto Duran versus Davy Moore, and I get sucked into the 4 Kings again all over. And even watching something like Marvin Hagler versus John McGabby. Totally underrated fight, as we said, these guys had Hall of Fame careers without each other.
I know. So Tommy Hearns, the head-to-head record, I didn't do it for you, John, I'll do it in a sec. The head-to-head record was he fought Haggler once and lost.
Yeah.
He fought Leonard twice. He lost once and he drew once.
Yeah.
And he beat Roberto Duran once. So Duran's record is he lost to Haggler once, he lost to Hearns. He lost to Leonard twice and beat him once.
Yeah. But I think, the dates of the Duran ones, are quite significant when you actually look at them, and I think when he beat Sugar Ray for the first time over 15, that was in the June of 1980, and then he went celebrating away in Panama, didn't he, Duran? And, Sugar Ray Leonard learned a lot from that fight, and you could see he carried it into the rest of his career with him, just how to hold himself, how not to let people get in his head, and he rushed him into the rematch because Duran. Yeah, totally. And Duran at one point they said bust up to about 187 pounds, and then they made him come back down to 147. It's you can talk about it so glowing terms, but to get Duran back in the ring 5 months later was a real stroke of genius, because he knew that Duran didn't have the distance there in his legs. And what happened to Duran? Did he have stomach cramps? Did he have issues with the weight? It was everything. But most of all, Sugar Ray, I think, just frustrated the hell out of him because Duran couldn't do what he did to him in the first fight, you know. So
well, Sugar Ray didn't fight the same way, did he?
no, not at all, because he knew at that point what made Duran tick, and you know, Duran was very much, I'm going to get in your face, and if I intimidate you, you know, I'll manage to break you. He'd already done that in the first fight, and Sugar Ray managed to adapt very, very quickly. So, you know, it was a stroke of genius to do it. The one that happened in '89 was a bit of a poor fight, wasn't it? But you know, it was still quite interesting to see the two legends coming against each other at that point.
Yeah, a fight shouldn't have happened. Certainly not at that weight.
No. What about Haggler then? Let's touch upon Haggler's career before we talk about individual fights then as such.
Yeah, So let's move on to Marvin Hagler. His career spanned from 1973 to 1987. His record was 62 3-2 with 52 knockouts, which was a staggering 78% KO ratio.
And solid middleweight. You know, as you say, he never went above middleweight. You know,
from middleweight, he fought his own career at middleweight, and he was champion for 7 years, from 1980 to 1987.
Yeah,
which in that era, with the standard of fighters that he was fighting, is outrageous.
Yeah, totally. And the thing about Haggler, you know, when you look at it, he had this big, massive chip on his shoulder because he wasn't meant to be anything. You know, he was just a guy. And interestingly, he was a very quiet guy, Marvin Hagler. He was very much, when he walked into the gym for the first time, you know, a guy who wasn't involved in, you know, gang warfare. He wasn't involved in fighting on the streets. And, you know, he was a quiet guy who just sat and apparently watched and watched and watched. Then he eventually, you know, started to train with the guys, which was the Petronellis, who are obviously, you know, Goody and Pat, who became very, very famous alongside him. You know, but when you watch how his career progressed, it took him 6 years to even get a world title shot, Marvin Hagler. You know, by which point, when he got his first world title fight against Vito Antiafermo, he was 46-2-1. You know, so absolutely, that's like Canelo's record almost at the moment, if you think about it in a way. And
I mean, when you get avoided, mate, what can you do?
No, absolutely. And, you know, but you see who he fought as he came up. You know, he fought a guy, Bigelow Watts. He fought the Willie Monroe, who was known as the Worm. These guys were hard as nails. And, you know, a lot of these fights happened in Philadelphia in a place called the Blue Horizon, which became legendary. And Marvin Hagler, you know, in Brockton, Massachusetts as well, became a massive name locally, but not globally. You know, and that's why he was so avoided. People would say nobody wants to fight him. You know, it wasn't until he won the world title that his name began to go around the world, and he did become a star. And all four of these guys became stars because they hit it at the right time, almost, because there was a void in boxing, because Ali had just retired and Larry Holmes was the champ. But for some reason, and we don't know because we weren't around in that era, it seems when you read the history books that people just didn't appreciate just how good Larry Holmes was.
I think people are starting to nowadays.
Oh, absolutely. You know, and it's taken him all this time, really, hasn't it, for people to say, what about Holmes' jab and his left hand, his right hand? But, you know, these guys kind of filled that heavyweight void that Ali left.
Yeah,
you know, and certainly, you know, when you look at someone like Marvin Hagler, he worked the hardest, you know, I think of the four throughout his career to actually make his name, you know. And when you've seen who he actually defended his title against, you know, as we say, Duran, Lenard, Hearns, Mugabe, you know, there was a couple of Juan Roldan was in there as well, a couple of other little fighters. You know, he was just a phenomenal fighter. And when he came to the UK and won his world title, he obviously won it against Alan Minter.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things I always remember is seeing that clip of him almost in the ring, and he's getting bottles thrown against him, he's getting beer against him, and, you know, he's just won the world title, and he never got the opportunity to celebrate it after all that in his career. And he himself thought that Antiafermo, that decision was stolen against him. That was a 15-round draw, you know, in Las Vegas when he went for his first world title fight. You know, that just put this big, massive chip on his shoulder, and he carried it forever.
He's going back there, isn't he?
Yeah, love him. Absolutely love him.
So, I mean, of the three losses, put the Leonard one to one side for a second. The other two, he avenged.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how you feel about the fight with Leonard. I'm guessing you're going to look at it the same way as me, that I thought Haggler won.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those, and it's the sourest thing and the saddest thing, because he was never given the opportunity to right that wrong. Leonard refused a rematch.
Yeah.
And Marvin Hagler rode off into the sunset, never to fight again.
Yeah.
Which was sad, really, because he shouldn't have gone out that way. But it is the way sometimes it is. I don't think Leonard wanted any part of him after that. I think he realised what he was all about.
I think when you look at them, and we do Leonard's record before we touch upon the fight against the two, and then let's go back to that point.
Sugar Ray Leonard, career span from 1977 to 1997. His record was 36-3-1 with a 62% knockout ratio. Now, that in comparison to the others, it's not the biggest KO ratio, but Leonard's style wasn't about that, was it?
No.
He was the slickest fighter of the lot, the prettiest fighter of the lot. I suppose you could argue Thomas Hearns as well in there, but what surprises me is it's a 20-year career, and there's 40 fights there.
Yeah, and this is what frustrates me about Leonard, and when people talk about, as I said, who's your favourites, Leonard isn't there for me at all, and his career was stop-start. And as someone who, and I'm not going to lie, I absolutely love Tommy Hearns. I always thought that, when Sugar Ray Leonard fought Tommy Hearns, he picked him because it was at the tail end of Tommy's career and he thought he could beat him. When he fought Haggler, it was the same. It was the tail end of his career and he thought he could beat him. So I often thought initially when I was younger that Sugar Ray kind of picked and chose his fights, had these big career breaks. So his career never really flowed as good as others. But it's not until you actually mature, I suppose, and go back and actually look at what Sugar Ray did. Sugar Ray's career is startling when you look at it at the start of his career. He won the Montreal Olympics, he came through, and then he won his world title. He was knocking people out, and he fought fantastic people like Wilfredo Benitez. Yep. And when you look at his career, before he even came across the Four Kings, it was a fantastic career. But again, I think he was a little bit injury prone initially with his eyes, wasn't he? But he'd almost retired a couple of times even before he fought Thomas Hearns, which was the first fighter of before he fought Roberto Duran, which is the first one that he actually fought of the Four Kings, because he had eye trouble. He was one of these guys as well who's very shy initially in front of the media, even though we don't see him as that way now. And he didn't even want to necessarily turn professional. He wanted to go away and do something else. He wanted to go to college. His mum and dad wanted him to become a professional, like a lawyer or an accountant or whatever, rather than a boxer. But he turned boxing because he'd won that medal and he wanted to provide for his young son. So, when you look at Leonard, his career was stop-start. And that's, for me, why I never really took to him as much. I also didn't like the fact he used to play with people's emotions, like Marvin Hagler. When those fights were about to be announced, a number of times people thought Leonard would retire. And there was a big infamous one where he had a retirement banquet evening where he's sitting in the middle of a ring, and I'm sure you've seen it because you're laughing away, and everybody's thinking, right, he's going to announce that he's fighting Hagler. He announced his retirement after inviting Marvin Hagler there to the evening. So Leonard was a real psychological guy as well.
It worked though, didn't it? Because it got Haggler to the point of madness at times.
Totally.
And I think Haggler always felt like Leonard was always seen as the golden boy.
Yeah.
Now I know that it was 4 years after Haggler first turned pro, but even so, I think he always felt like he was in the shadow a little bit and never got the credit he deserved.
Yeah, and I think that was Haggler comes from a real, working class, family. I think he obviously at one point he moved down the social scale, but I think initially Marvin Hagler was born into a working class family. Then his parents got divorced and he had to go into the projects. So he kind of knew what it was like to have a nicer life. Haggler then have it taken away from him, and then he seen Leonard winning the world the gold medal, then the world title, and he thought, yeah, this has been spoon fed to him. Then all of a sudden, Sugar Ray Leonard signed a contract with 7-Up, and then he was on Wheatos. So everywhere Marvin Hagler was looking, he was seeing him on cereal boxes, on soda cans, and he's thinking, why this guy? Why not me? And Sugar Ray, to a certain degree, did have it handed to him, But as I say, when you look back at that record, he's a true fighter through and through. You know,
you
no
can't,
one
you
beats
can't
those
take
headed meters. No.
away from him, and his skill set was unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, he had the ability. He had the ability to box on the outside and not let anyone touch him, but he also had the ability to stand and trade.
Yeah, yeah.
And people forget that about Leonard.
And I think there's a lot of the fights which he had early on in his career, you know, when you look at him, because obviously he fought Floyd Mayweather's dad at one point during his career. He fought a guy from England, Dave Boy Green. You know, when you look at a lot of these fights which he actually had, you know, they were absolute, you know, standing toe-to-toe at one point. Now, they weren't wars as such because Sugar Ray was in control, but he was throwing clusters of punches, sometimes 10, 12 punches, you know, and he was finishing guys off. And we've seen it when he went up and then obviously challenged Tommy Hearns, you know, and they had their massive welterweight showdown, you know. That the finale of that fight was unbelievable. You know, it was just truly unbelievable. Maybe the best place to start now is going through the kind of lists of fights which they had. You know, you had mentioned the first two to face off of the Four Kings was Duran and Leonard in 1980. You know, and it was a really interesting, you know, build up to that one. One of the things I love about that is Duran got into Sugar Ray Leonard's head by Sugar Ray said years later, he walked up to him and he whispered into his ear, like, after I beat you, I'm going to take your wife. You know, and he said it right in front of Sugar Ray's kid, you know, and he said it in words which we'll not repeat, you know, and Sugar Ray said, who is this guy? You know, and he looked him in the eyes and he was a complete madman, you know, and then they were filming an advert for 7-Up and Duran walked up to him and like, I'll need to swear this point, Duran walked up to him and went, you're a motherfucker. And Sugar Ray said he'd never had anybody calling him that before in his whole life. And he looked at Duran and he was just completely deadpan. And he never said anything. Then the camera went off, and Duran said, "Can I get a picture for my with you and your kids?" And Sugar Ray said, "The guy just flipped." So 1 minute he was calling me this, and the next minute he was asking for a picture, and that's what lost Sugar Ray the first fight.
Well, yeah, because Sugar Ray tried to stand and trade with him.
Yeah, yeah.
He was never going to beat Duran at that.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But as we said, though, when you watch the fight, Duran in that fight, there was all action. You know,
Yeah.
And the one thing which, again, people like have often discussed, where was Roberto Duran best? Was he best at lightweight or was he best at welterweight? You know, for me, he was best as a lightweight.
I think so. Yeah, I have to agree, mate.
And I think he was the best lightweight of all time. And when you look at what he actually did, you know, there's probably only Benny Leonard, which maybe compares with Roberto Duran at lightweight. When you look at what he did, he had 12 world title fights, but in between that, he probably had about 8 non-title fights as well during his reign there. Fought legendary guy Esteban de Jesus 4 times. His record is just absolutely phenomenal at lightweight. So to then jump up to welterweight and put on that performance against who was then the golden boy of boxing, you know, it was an amazing performance because Duran's, I watched Sky have got it on at the current time as part of their Top Rank deal. So you can actually watch the Duran Leonard one at the moment. I watched it on Sky last week. Again, it's phenomenal. Duran is punching in bunches. He's coming to the body. He's working the body well. He's pushing Leonard back in the ring. Leonard doesn't necessarily know at times how to deal with it, but then he does flurries back. It really is an entertaining 15-round fight.
It's a great fight. Very close as well.
Yeah. But the decision was right in it, wasn't it? You know,
and that really, really hurt Leonard. That it really hurt him. And obviously you saw from the rematch the hunger that Leonard had going back for that second fight.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Duran obviously spent, I don't know, however many weeks on a bender.
Yeah. Well, they say that when Duran went back to Panama after that loss, you know, the first time he was met by the president, he had Cadillacs put on for him. There was village parades, everything which you would think of a champion get. After the Leonard fight, he couldn't even go back to Panama after the second fight because of everybody thought he quit. You know, and like I remember when I was watching that Four Kings video for the first time and seeing the no mass incident, I'm saying, well, what happened there? But when you actually watch the fight and read the backstory, how quickly they got him back into the ring, when you see Duran's persona and about how he himself doesn't want to actually ever give any ground, I can kind of understand why he quit. You know, and
I think he gave everything he had in the tank.
Yeah.
Nothing left. And he knew all that was going to happen. He was just going to get battered.
Yeah, yeah.
Because he had nothing left.
Yeah, I think so, and you can see, there's just nothing there. But then when you think of Duran and what's his greatness, he then comes back and he beats Davy Moore and he beats Ram Barkley, as you've said. So he manages to redeem himself a little bit. But in that fight, he just didn't meet Sugar Ray anywhere in any condition that he should have done. And then so we get those two fights in the 1980. And what a year that would have been. To be a boxing fan. We're too young for it, really. But then you see the record in the next again year in September, because Sugar Ray's managed to win the rematch against Duran, he's matched with Tommy Hearns. And both of them are holding, I think Sugar Ray's the WBC champion after beating Benitez, and after beating Pepino Cuevas, Tommy Hearns is the WBA champion, and they come together in a legendary fight, absolute legendary fight. And I don't know what you think when you watch that fight, but I never knew who won it the very first time I seen it, and again I still remember.
You know what? My mind differs when I watch it. It's one of them. It's great, just a great fight. But there's so many like that from this era. There's so many fights. I mean. We've talked about judges recently and how they make mistakes. How would judges have gone about getting the right results from fights in them days?
No.
Let's quickly move on to what weight do you think was best for Tommy Hearns? Because I never said this, but Tommy Hearns was obviously a 5-weight world champion, from welterweight up to super middleweight. Where do you see him as? I mean, for such a tall fighter, where do you see him as his best weight? What suited him best?
I think he was most devastating at welterweight, and he was young enough and his body could hold it, but I've always kind of thought that Tommy Hearns was probably best at 154, which would be old light middleweight. Now, it wasn't a weight that any of the fighters hung around at when they passed through it at all. No. But I've always thought that was probably Tommy Hearns' ideal weight, just based on his results. Which
it was a new weight at the time as well.
It was, and when he beat Roberto Duran and knocked Duran out in 2 rounds, that was at light middle. Yeah. But then he obviously had to move up and fight Haggler. His body wasn't ready to do that at that point. He was probably still grown into that particular weight. And then when you see what happened to him against Ram Barkley, again, it probably took, even though he had been up to light heavy, his body just wasn't, for me, quite right at middleweight. There was just something not right from middleweight. So I would say Tommy Hearns' probably best weight was welterweight or light middle. So 147 or 154.
I have to agree. His speed, his movement, his aggression at welterweight and either light mid or super welterweight, whatever you want to call it, was almost untouchable.
Yeah.
At times. He had to change his style when he went up through the weights, and I think he realised when he met Marvin Hagler at middleweight, I think he realised he had to do something about his style. He couldn't take shots on the back foot the way he could at the lower weights and walk through them, because, well, you saw what happened in that fight.
Yeah.
He had to sit down on his shots a bit more. He had to be a bit more sturdy, a bit more steady. He wasn't as light on his feet when he started moving, certainly at light heavy. So he had to change his style a little bit. And I preferred, more than anything, his earlier weights and the lower weights, his earlier fights.
I loved him when he was almost on the balls of his feet, and he had that jab going. It was almost piston-like when he had his jab going, and I've referred to it a couple of times in the Pepino Cuevas fight, but he set him up so well, and Cuevas had been a long reigning champion when Tommy Hearns took him out, and his jab just kept going and going and going, and that was a Manuel Stewart trait. That's what him and Tommy Hearns worked on. And that's what got Hearns through the tougher fights of his career, because one of his amazing performances was against Virgil Hill at light heavyweight. And that was a performance where he outboxed a boxer, so Tommy Hearns had this fantastic jab. So I think for me, Duran, I would say lightweight was his best. Hearns, that 147 to 154. What about Lenard? That's an interesting one.
For me, same again. I think Leonard's best weight was welter.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think, obviously, because of Leonard's style, the extra weight doesn't suit.
No.
And because of that, he doesn't look as good.
Yeah.
Not as clinical. Fights were becoming a lot closer the more weight he put on and the heavier fighters he went in against, because he wasn't able to keep them off. So definitely for Leonard, welterweight for me.
Yeah, me too. I think as you say,
obviously Marvin Hagler spent his whole career at middleweight. Just a quick one. Where do you see Marvin Hagler as the in the list of best middleweights of all time?
Oof, he's got to be, for me, one or two. You've got Carlos Monzon or you've got Marvin Hagler. And that's where it sits for me. And I think probably just based on the quality of opposition, I'd probably just let Haggler pick it, actually, and I'd put Haggler at number one. But Monzon was fantastic, as well, really great fighter. But yeah, I'm going to go with Haggler, and it's not a one from the heart. I think it's just one he just fought the better opponents across that long career.
I have to agree, mate. I have to agree. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are going to say Sugar Ray Robinson because he was outstanding as well. We're going to get people screaming at us for not putting Sugar Ray at number one, but there you go. Okay, just quickly then, because I want to bring this show to a close. Name all four then in order, mate. Best to worst.
Best to worst? Okay, I've got to go. Best to worst would be, for me, the best is Sugar Ray. Sugar Ray Leonard is number one for me. I think when you look at the record in comparison to each other, he beat every one of them. And whether it was convincing or not against Haggler, he still beat him. Throw in the fifth king, which is Wilfredo Benitez, and Sugar Ray was the only one to stop him. Yeah. So for me, Sugar Ray actually sits at the top of the pile, even though, personally, my least favourite. Then I would actually say it's Roberto Duran in terms of what he did at lightweight, as opposed to against the four kings. Then Haggler, then Hearns.
Okay. I differ slightly. I hear what you're saying about Leonard beat them all, but in my opinion, he didn't beat Haggler. I know the record books say he did, but in my opinion, he didn't. So for that reason, Marvin Hagler's number one for me. I am speaking a little bit from favouritism here.
Yeah.
On pure boxing skill, Leonard has to be number one, but on pure aggression, ring IQ, fighting aggression, fighting style, nobody could stop Marvin Hagler.
Yeah, I agree.
He didn't. He never got stopped in his career. Anyway, that kind of tells you it all. So for me, it's Haggler, Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran.
See, it's that is the beauty of this debate, because if we're rating them against each other, I've got a different way of rating them as well. Because if we rate them against each other, for me, it's Sugar Ray Leonard, it's Marvin Hagler, it's Roberto Duran, it's Tommy Hearns. So it all kind of differs around. But favouritism, my favourite fighters of all time, as I've said, they probably join in terms of Marvin Hagler and Tommy Hearns. Then it's Roberto Duran. Sugar Ray's not even in the equation. So you can bounce them around. But if you take them pound for pound, I'm quite comfortable with my Sugar Ray, then Roberto Duran, Hagler, Hearns as a pound for pound. But they're just brilliant. And boxing is...
Chris, we could do another 45 minutes on this. I'm absolutely positive.
Absolutely.
And we will do. But for now, we're going to bring this one to a close. I hope you all enjoy the show. Like, comment, subscribe. We'll see you on the next one.